there are going to be a lot of pictures, just letting you know. When Charlotte was crowned in September, I haven't got the clicker. Sorry, I apologise. When Charlotte was crowned in September 1761, the 17-year-old queen became the first consort in 25 years. Her main roles would be as queen wife and mother of heirs, while taste in portraiture had developed since the 1730s when Queen Caroline died. This is Queen Caroline. The iconography of queenship had, naturally, not. Like Charlotte, Queen Caroline was a well-educated German princess with an interest in the arts and botany, but Charlotte did not yet have a great interest in painting, keeping the forms devised by Kneller for her state portraits and most official royal image. This is actually by Enoch Seaman, great name. Here Caroline is in upright, staunch and jewelled mass, standing alone with the symbols of power, her crown and sceptre. She's an icon stripped of real personality in a ceremonial uniform of velvet and ermine, rather than the real everyday or fashionable court dress. This very fixed and safe image of queenship and wifehood was widely disseminated, found in aristocratic homes and local guild halls as signs of loyalty at a time of Jacobite threat, and as prints in humbler homes. So this is a print of an image by Kneller. In aristocratic homes, humbler homes, print shop windows, pubs used to put them on the wall. Well, the equivalent of pubs, really, it was men's clubs and coffee houses and other shops. So this is by Jacopo Amigoni, and it's of Queen Caroline again. Caroline had also cemented the second main role of royal wife in paint, the mother of heirs. There are 7 little baby heads in this cornucopia. She sits in state, and if you were a viewer, if you were in real life, you would have had to stand in her presence. In fashionable dress, surrounded by putti and accompanied by the unique accessory of a cornucopia full of babies. She's crowned with the laurel of fame and the crown of Great Britain. She is a highly educated and sophisticated woman. Caroline appreciated classical iconography and imagery, and would have been familiar via prints with the allegorical and fancy dress portraits being produced for regal families in Europe. Britain did not yet have the wealth of artists found in France, etc., so its visual language was not as suave. Caroline had to employ a foreign artist, Amigoni, to create fashionable image with mythic flair. This image would also have been open to viewing in staterooms of palaces and such, where these were displayed, but open to the public and open to anyone dressed correctly. And this picture was also published as a print. Now, this picture is over 1 metre tall, to give you an idea. The image of royal motherhood was developed in the years after Caroline's death by George III's mother, Princess Augusta, there she is, and by a woman of highly developed aesthetic sensibilities who used British artists such as George Knapton and French artist Jean-Baptiste Valot to display an image of royal maternality that was new yet rooted in the past. Now, this is by Jean-Baptiste Valot, and she's sitting there with her children, governesses, lady-in-waiting, and the chamberlain of her household. And then this is George Knapton. She had 11 children, and her future king is here, and his father standing over him here. These pieces, both images, are a great deal and actively recall the work of Van Dyck in the Royal Collection. It's called The Great Piece, and it's from 1632. It may seem strange that a new dynasty wished to be connected to a failed one, the Stuarts, at a time when the Stuarts were actually threatening it. But Van Dyck was considered the most skillful artist to have worked in Britain, and in the 1730s and 40s it became fashionable to wear Van Dyck dress to masquerades and for your portrait. There was also a political reason for choosing to ape Van Dyck. It was claiming and assimilating the Stuart legacy for the Hanoverians, using Stuart image against the Stuarts. In addition to the obvious religious overtones, so you've got the Virgin surrounded by saints and carrying her child. The organisation of very many Virgin and Child could be mapped onto these images. Onto the Vantelot and the Knapton is an overwhelming image of dynasty. Whatever happens, there's going to be a Hanoverian to take over. Both of seemingly lone women in a seat of power, but in both a man is there to guide. In person in the Van Loo, in the face of her Chamberlain, and as the guiding image on the wall in the Neptune. And both display how the royal family was in safe, if female, hands. This is Alan Ramsay. Though 25 years later than the Seaman state portraits, I never thought I'd say that loud, this image of 17-year-old Charlotte as Queen shows little development, save the Rococo paint style of the Scottish artist Alan Ramsay and the fictive architecture behind, in which the figure is placed. She too is staunch and timeless, but recognisable as Charlotte. Likeness was very important to a royal image, so Charlotte's features, considered plain by her contemporaries and commented on her so, they actively said she's plain but she's amiable, so it's okay, could not be fudged. It was necessary that the royal figure could be recognisable, particularly in state portraits that would be sent around the world. Now, 60 copies of this exist, at least 60, 100 of the accompanying George, and they were sent as far as Russia. George would forever be in your pocket on the coinage, but up until the development of exhibition culture in the 1670s, the Queen would be seen more rarely. However, she is not merely an icon to whether viewers' projected opinion. Ramsay captures much truth. Beyond the gems, this stomacher cost £60,000 at the time, and it was very well known. The dress falls off her shoulder slightly. I think it's more apparent in this version. No, she's got white hair here. It did in real life. Her clothes for her coronation, which happened 2 weeks after she arrived in Great Britain, were very heavy and were actually made in her absence, and they didn't fit her. And at her wedding, her dress fell off. In this white-haired portrait, Ramsay updates the image, adding fashionable hair, so that since the Queen had started wearing her hair white and powdered, it would still be recognisable as the Queen. Just to say, she's got here her regalia, her own crown, and her sceptres, and these appear again and again and again in portraits. So these are them together. It's currently on display at the Queen's Gallery, and you can see they're not really a pair because they don't complement each other. Though the details of the state portrait did not change, this is by Joshua Reynolds from 1779. They could be updated. Reynolds had become the president of the King's newly founded Royal Academy, and when Ramsay was no longer able to paint, needed to be honoured. These two paintings are not a pair, but work as individual portraits. And Reynolds has tried to add flair to the George by making him sit in King Edward's seat, etc., and try to make it a more dynamic picture. He hasn't done very much with Charlotte. They were not popular with the sitters, and Reynolds was not asked to paint anything else for the royal family. These two, like the Ramsays, existed in multiples. However, it was not these grand images that most people would meet their Queen, but in prints. So you can see there's a print, they just kept changing and updating the same thing. This is by Thomas Fry. Thomas Fry is little known now, it's from 1762, but he was a skilled engraver. In 1761, he created and produced rapidly what is considered to be the first abstract image of Charlotte in the UK, a meta tint of her taken while she was, the drawing of which was taken when she was in the theatre. She's decked in her wedding jewellery, it's very famous at the time, gatherings of pearls, cross, this choker, girandole earrings, and what was actually a proto tiara. And expensive lace. It's from images like this and hundreds of other prints, and these are just a few of her for the same thing, tiny little prints, and these as well. It was from images like these and hundreds of other prints, some official and some unofficial, that the Queen would have been known. In 1764, saw the creation of two very different images of Charlotte as royal mother. This is by Alan Ramsay. Achieving her primary function by then, she'd had two sons, George, and I can't remember the next one, to record, celebrate and promote the security of the Hanoverian dynasty. Charlotte sat to Ramsay again for this large painting. Again, it's 2 meters high. Of herself and her toddler boys. Though she is in relaxed informal dress, this is a relaxed informal dress for the day, and the boys are in frocks, this is a dynastic image. Again, it harks back to Van Dyck in form. Oh, yeah, let's get back to Van Dyck. Sorry. There we go, so she's like this. Let me know if people start getting epileptic. Yeah, it harks back to Van Dyck in form. Religious paintings, the Virgin and Christ Child and St. John in flavour, and it distances the sitter from her subjects by placing her in a great fictive space. However, Ramsay acknowledges the aesthetic sensibilities of the times by having the Queen sit at her harpsichord with her sewing equipment, sign of domestic virtue and productivity, as if the children were not enough, and her books. Locke's thoughts on the education of children display her enlightened education and thinking. Charlotte was a well-educated princess who spoke and read German and French, learnt English and read Latin well enough to pursue serious study in botany. She played the harpsichord and glockenspiel and sang well enough to perform with the Mozart family, and she was one of their earliest patrons. Right, this was made in the same year, 1764, and she's with her eldest sons again. This is by Johann Zoffany. Charlotte's modern ideals were displayed in this second image of motherhood. Johann Zoffany's Queen and her two eldest children at Buckingham House. This is not a fictive space, but the Queen's new house, bought for her by George III as a family home, away from St James's Palace. Here, Charlotte's modern Rococo taste is fully displayed and recorded by Zoffany. It is an extraordinary image in the iconography and in the royal collection. It's not very big, it's not 2 metres. An elegant woman in her boudoir with her large mastiff and her 2 small children. It seems so effortless. I can't think it's quite cool. But it was a highly controlled image, though utterly private. It's a small painting that was not disseminated as a print. All the background objects are on display the royal taste, while Zoffany uses the mirror to capture the complete likeness of Charlotte. So this is her profile view. The princes appear to be having fun in their fancy dress, but even this was designed as a symbol. The future King George is dressed as Telemachus, the son of Ulysses, who travelled to seek a wise counsel, while his younger brother is merely an anonymous Turk. This is one of the few images of Charlotte alone without King George as a pair or or within the image, but she's not completely alone. The royal governess is in the next room, keeping an eye on Charlotte, and Charlotte's actually sitting at the mirror preparing to get dressed for dinner with the king. So this is by Francis Coates, 1767, and it's a pastel. Pastel image of Queen Charlotte and her first daughter, but fourth child, Princess Charlotte, was displayed at the Royal Society of Artists and greatly praised. It was new for a queen to be portrayed not only with a sleeping infant, but also addressing the viewer and breaking the picture plane, acknowledging them, oh my word, directly. The portrait was popular with the king, so popular that it was kept in his room until his death, and he had an expanded version made of it in August. So this is the expanded version. While this picture again harks back to the Van Dyck, it is thought that it was painted as a direct response to an Annibale Carracci painting called Silence that the king had purchased in 1766 and kept in his closet opposite the portrait. This image has a separate important royal pedigree. In 1737, George's father Frederick was at odds with his parents and commissioned a portrait of his wife and their newly born daughter. So this is Augusta. Their first child was a daughter. Frederick had whisked his wife away from his parents as her waters broke, so this baby could be born in St James's, and this action caused a rift. This image was cooking a snook at the King and Queen Caroline, celebrating Frederick's family, and even if the baby was female, and doing so by framing Augusta as the Virgin. However, in Charlotte, we do not see a distant Virgin, but a mother engaged with the viewer, a distinct and important change. So this is another version of that painting. It's in Warwick Castle. This is the last image of Charlotte with an individual infant. Though 9 more would follow, the siring of an heir, a spare, and a first daughter, all that merited individual representation and celebration. Okay. These next images show Charlotte as part of a family, part of a group. They are a newish domestic form, the conversation piece, a work that was created to provide a sort of discussion in the home or when you had visitors, they'd have a chat about it. This is by Zoffany. It's from 1769. Again, it's a small picture, and it's the king and queen with their 6 eldest children. This group of George III, Charlotte, and their children, small, intimate in scale, but draws again on the historically important work of Van Dyck. So, yeah, okay. So he's in black, she's in yellow. It's the family group again, same composition. Both figuratively and literally, sourcing the poses and costumes from a mixture of Van Dyck paintings. The right half sees the great piece that I've just shown you referenced, while the children on the left, these two, are copied in pose from the Villiers children, which was in the Royal Collection. It's from 1635, these two. So you go back, clicky, and you see the same colour clothes, same portrait, same pose. In his study for the piece, Zoffany even copied the colour of the king's clothes from the paintings. For the royal family to pose in costume is quite a dangerous act. Costume pictures, costuming and masquerade were fashionable, but they were risky because the act of assuming a false identity was congruent with lying and dissimulation, pretending, acting and trickery being synonymous. It was a particularly daring act for a family that was still considered by some to be usurpers. George III referenced the Stuart monarchy in a self-consciously patriotic act. He had declared that he gloried in the name of Britain. And here Charlotte is below her husband. She's connected to her pastime of flowers and botany, and she's connected to him by his arm. Under his aegis, just like the children, and she takes up as much space and is the same height, if not smaller, than her eldest son, so she's on the same plane, compact. This image was produced in a print, one recently sold for £3,000, and individual prints, so of one section, of Charlotte and her toddlers were also sold. In fact, if you really loved the piece, you could own it in porcelain. Derby made them. Or you could have a whole family group you could put on your table. This is another Zoffany from 1771. And this is a family group of Charlotte and her eldest brothers, Ernst and Prince Carl. And these are her 3 oldest children and the governess, Lady Charlotte Finch. Zoffany continued to be the royal family's painter of choice, and here he creates the closest thing Charlotte would have to a highly orchestrated and utterly controlled family snapshot. In 1771, Charlotte's older brothers visited her in Britain, and this meeting is commemorated by this piece. It is a charming, if on closer inspection, unlikely country walk. Charlotte sits as the most royal person. Her brothers were mere princes and she was a queen, while 3 of her 8 children, Charlotte, William and Ernst, vie for her and her brother's attention. The inclusion of Lady Charlotte Finch, again, displays the Georgian idea of family, that a trusted royal servant could be included with well-beloved brothers. Below the charming vignettes of children, dolls, Zoffany again alludes to works in the Royal Collection, this time Rubens of the Holy Family and St. Francis, which would have pleased his patrons and added to the experience of owning such a conversation piece. This is another rare image of Charlotte where there is no sign of her husband, but in the person of her children. She is again dressed not in regal splendour, splendour being relative, but in a day dress for walking in the garden. Though this image is small and highly domestic in tone, it was displayed at the newly formed Royal Academy, showed to the public the private family, but one with international connections. Zoffany again, 1771. This final Zoffany, painted in 71, is a delicious riot of colour and textures, where Charlotte's face and hands escape the dance. In fact, it's an image of a wealthy woman of fashion, displaying her taste in clothes, jewels, hair and furnishings, and again her interest in botany. She always loves these flowers. while Charlotte wears the portrait bracelet of George, given to her as her part of her wedding present, still exists somewhere. This is not a solo image of the Queen, but part of a pair. It is part of a pair where Charlotte represents the feminine, the domestic and the aesthetic. So pretty, and not very thoughtful or powerful in its outline. And George, the masculine. They are a pair, but not a pair as well-designed opposites, not the traditional in complementing each other in pose, but in philosophy. She is Rococo and he is military. She is buried in a mass of colour and serpentine movement through the fabrics. And he is clearly outlined in black. Even the colour palette is opposite. So he's got this plain black outline, bright red, man spreading. They are fascinating images. It was commented by Horace Walpole that the image of George was very like, but disagreeable and unmeaning figure. His white leg pose was ungentlemanly, but it makes him take up as much space in the picture plane as Charlotte's hoops and fabric. And his ungentlemanliness is sort of the thing of being rugged. It's the 18th century version of rugged, this.
He looks like a Johnson there.
Yeah, they are related.
I sat next to him on the tube this morning.
So this is John Hale by Reynolds. And the 18th century is famous in Britain for portraits of women as muses, goddesses, she's being music, and saints wearing billowing imaginary clothes. And here you see that. This throwing away of true identity was fine for a duchess and piquant for a courtesan, but was counterintuitive for a queen whose job was her identity. However, Charlotte did venture beyond her roles as queen, wife, mother in her iconography and joined the fashion not only for allegory but for fancy clothing that was meant to be timeless. Here we go. This is by Angelica Kaufman and it's from the 1770s. Reynolds had advocated making portraits eternal and not merely fashion plates by turning the work into a more elevated work, a history painting. Charlotte was a great patron of female artists and writers. She was friends with Mrs. Delaney, the lady, the botanist illustrator. Fanny Burney was a member of her household, and Mary Moser, one of the two female founders of the Royal Academy with Angelica Kaufman, she got her to teach her daughters to paint. She commissioned her only foray into the fantastical in a portraiture by the only female founder of the RA, Swiss artist Angelica Kaufman. The work, Queen Charlotte Raising Up the Genius of Fine Arts, was painted the same year as the Zoffany, so 71 72, but could not be more different. It only survives as a print, but it is clearly not a successful painting. Unlike the vital Reynolds and similar, Charlotte just stands inert, blank, wearing a dressing gown and waking the arts, personified by a portrait of her son, the future George IV with strap-on wings. She's less engaged with the viewer than in coats, and this dullness might be caused by the fact that the city was royal and the venture potentially hazardous, or by Kaufman not being the best painter of her age. We know Charlotte could look animated. We know that she was a great patron of the arts. We do not know what happened to this original painting, but it was the first and last time Charlotte made this experiment, and it would have to wait until Queen Victoria to play such royal games with identity. So this is Benjamin West's Queen Charlotte with her eldest daughter Charlotte. In 1776, during the American War of Independence, Charlotte sat to an American, Benjamin West, for another painting with her eldest daughter, now 10. Here, Charlotte and Charlotte are engaged in that then most feminine and useful of pursuits, needlework. Princess Royal is showing her mother her efforts, while the dexterous queen breaks from her tatting to draw her daughter's attention to a bust of Minerva, goddess of wisdom. This image of maternal pedagogy and pride develops Charlotte's image as a caring mother. It is notable, but not surprising, that Charlotte is teaching a female child. By the age of 10, her sons would have been in the hands of a wholly male household. This image is also striking for its transience. The Queen is in very fashionable contemporary dress, just look at the hair, with a large coiffure, which was much lampooned in the press and by satirists at the time. This image of a fashionable Charlotte was turned into a print, with the idea of a fashionable woman, so it was cut down to just this. Quite an important idea in Georgian society as being fashionable, was not embraced. She was remembered for being dowdy, dull and stuffy, and likely to take snuff. 3 years later, West was again called on to create images of Charlotte and George. The American War was still ongoing and George was painted uniquely as a military leader with a camp of soldiers behind him. Charlotte was painted as the group opposite in character and even colour. Her surroundings may be draped in matching red, but she is completely white apart from her face. Not only in fashionable garb, but also an image of unstained purity. White was still a symbol of purity. Her camp is behind her, her role embodied in the 13 children who play and pose in front of Charlotte's private house, the Queen's Lodge, and Windsor Castle. This layered composition is a complete description of the public Charlotte in 1779. Fido, wifely faithfulness, is at the forefront. The crown and regalia next, the actual figure of Charlotte wrapped in these. Then behind her, her achievements, her children, her building schemes, and Windsor Castle, a symbol of the lasting status of the monarchy. It's a much more successful portrait than that of George, but this did not make it popular or mass-produced. So there's George again. So in 1781, Thomas Gainsborough, the other image is over 2 metres tall. This one is another one that's 2 metres tall. Thomas Gainsborough got the chance to tackle Charlotte. So doing, produced a portrait so popular with the sitter that it became an unofficial state portrait for over a decade, copied as a painting, miniature and print, and later updated by the artist's nephew and pupil, Gainsborough Dupont. So he just took it and changed the dress.
Is that a Camberwell carrot in her fingers?
It's a very expensive one made of tortoise shell and jewels. It's her fan. Gainsborough's image, one of a pair, there's a George, is considered a tour de force of his late flowing style. It presents the Queen in the most formal attires, court dress, in the least likely of actions, walking her dog. And it is this, plus Gainsborough's light handling, that makes the image successful and flattering. By this stage, Charlotte had given birth to 14 of her 15 children, the most recent, the year before. It was likely she was pregnant when this was painted, or when it was planned, but this attitude is hidden by her arms and the graceful display of her fan. Apart from taking snuff, Charlotte was known for her beautiful deployment of the fan, which was an important thing to be able to do. Her torso is fudged and hidden, and her unfashionable... She's swathed to the neck in muslin, which used to fill in her décolletage. Disguised by Gainsborough's magical rendering of fabric. Charlotte is spotlit, giving a sense of movement, and the sight of her likeness, her head, is highlighted by the dark red drapery. The flow of Gainsborough's paint undoes the formality of her dress and the nature of her portrait, making the work the happy likeness with character rather than a mere image of the Queen, and it was described as the most happy likeness of her by critics. Another Gainsborough. But this is interesting. Gainsborough's personality and success in his offering of 1781, the full length, saw him commissioned by George III again in 1782, and Charlotte sat in September of that year. It may not seem like this modest head and shoulders would need a different sitting from the large portrait, but it did. The scale of this work is important, it's not very large. Here Charlotte is just not a housewife in an ugly cap, but part of a hive. So this is nearly all their children. Gainsborough was commissioned to paint the whole family. They only managed 15 of the 16. One from another person's work, and alas, another from memory, who would die before, this is faded baby Prince Alfred, who died before the artist could complete the work. When this was displayed at Somerset House, the Queen's image would have been interpreted as that of a mother in mourning. Nothing in her dress would have needed to be changed to show this. Black and white being the colours of mourning at that time. While these big full-length paintings and R-ray displayed images were being made, displayed, reproduced, etc., and seen by a wider public, private images circulated amongst the royal family. Miniatures such as this by Jeremiah Mayer in 1772, and this by Richard Crosway in 1795, few centimetres in size, were commissioned regularly by the Queen to be given not only to her loyal servants, but to her children. Here the Queen was shown in super fashionable dress, hair and caps, a private person trying out styles that might not suit her, or that could have been ridiculed in the press. There's a gap of some years between the popular Gainsborough full length and the next officially sanctioned image of Charlotte. This is by William Beechey, and it's from 1796. It's not that portraits did not occur. One of the most striking and original paintings did, and I'll come to that later, but it was not chosen as a sanctioned royal image. In its place was this dull Beechey. The Queen wears the latest fashion, something he largely ignores about her. She's got a high-waisted dress on, which is becoming the thing, Regency. And she carries a familiar small dog. She's got the bracelet of the king again, and there's another dog, Gambles, beside her. These are quite a contrast to the giant mastiff you see in the Zoffany portraits of the children. She's alone apart from these and her bracelet of King George. She wears a black veil of mourning, thought to be for one of her family members, and she has this memorialised in paint, a moment of sorrow. But it was used in prints a couple of years to come. And here's in a book plate. So, sorry this is a bit dark, but it's really worth looking at if you're interested. This is by Peter Edward Strolling. Though this is a small painting, it was still a public image, and it was made in 1807 for the future George IV and displayed in Carlton House, where it could be seen by his contemporaries. This is the last ad vivum image of Charlotte, sanctioned by the Queen. After her husband's confirmed insanity in 1810, she thought it incorrect to have herself painted. Here, the 63-year-old Queen sits in a completely fictive surrounding, a figure of Minerva Britannia here, crowning her with laurels, small dog sitting looking for her attention. The Queen, in most fashionable dress of the day, she's in proper Regency gear by now, a high Regency gown, there's an image of George at her breast and gazes directly at the viewer. It's very important, look at portraits, always look at where the sitter is looking. She frequently doesn't look. Her position as Queen is confirmed by the inclusion of her familiar small crown and the sceptre. This image shows no signs of vanity amidst the pomp of queenship. It was not reproduced but kept by George IV with 5 other images of his unmarried sisters, the nunnery at his house. This was his image of his Queen and mother. So this is a portrait by James Thompson from 1817, and this is a collection of portraits produced in the latter years of her life and after her death. They used these earlier images, but this is the year before her death. She died in 1880. These images are those used to commemorate Charlotte after her death. This image by James Thompson claims to have been taken from life while the Queen was at Bath in 1817. It just shows for the first time a wrinkled Charlotte in drab clothing, nothing to single her out as royalty. It was a popular image mass-produced after her death in 1818. You can find it on the cups. The other images show the variety of domestic-sized prints of Charlotte in her later years, all of just her face and emitting direct symbols of royalty. By this stage, Charlotte, as a magnificent bejewelled queen, had faded, and she was recalled as a domestic hausfrau, taking the waters in her cap and shawl. The former images are all in the Royal Collection and were displayed at Society of Arts, the Royal Academy, and reproduced in detailed copies of metatids, copperplate engravings. However, the image of queenship was also presented to the public in another way, in satirical images. Satirical prints that attacked both Caroline and Augusta, but in them their actions were attacked. Their personal appearance was very clear, it was kept very able to discern them. And that was important. And they were abused in speech bubbles or by the appearance of those around them, abused by association. Charlotte, however, was not so lucky. Though she was not political, as Caroline had been, She was still attacked for the politics that surrounded her, and this attack was displayed in the way her body was described. The most dynamic and comprehensive attacks came from James Gilray, and some will be shown here, but other illustrators such as Richard Newton and Robert Dighton also distorted the royal person for effect, not as fantastically or brutally. So this is called the Queen of Hearts and Diamonds by an anonymous artist in 1786. Charlotte had access to the greatest collection of jewels any Queen of Great Britain has had. George III encouraged their use. He wanted her to be jewelled. In 1780, Charlotte was presented with a great diamond by the Nizam of Deccan, and here she is roasted for it, and her love of gems, and her fashion for taking snuff. But it's not too unkind an image. There's the diamond, meant to be the diamond in the shape of a heart. She's got turban on, that shows her love of fashion. She's got diamonds everywhere, and her features are somewhat caricatured. She had a retroussé nose, and they always caricature it. This is Gilray, and it's called Affability. In this 1795 image, Farmer George, as the king was known, takes his small, lightly satirised snuff-box-wielding wife on a tour of the farms and peoples. Charlotte is not too violently mocked here. She's drab and small and over-rouged, but she's not vile. So it's called the Anti-Saccharinites, or John Bull and his family leaving off the use of sugar from 1792. Here the royal family are given the identity of John Bull, but they're refusing sugar as a support for the abolition movement. Charlotte was an abolitionist. It's given a cynical and negative interpretation. They are giving it up to save money. The royal couple, famously frugal table, they didn't eat very much, was a subject of mirth, particularly in contrast to the Prince of Wales's famous love of luxury. Here Charlotte's features are grotesquely manipulated and her teeth filed to points. She's got vampire teeth. Her hands are bony and inelegant, and she's the centre of the image and the focus of Gilray's ire. Her daughters and the king are treated with more mercy. Charlotte was noted for the width of her mouth and the depth of her nostrils, though she had a small retroussé nose. She would have been feted now, but the taste in faces was different in the 18th century. This is called the Monstrous Crawls at a New Coalition Feast of 1787. Here Charlotte is joined with her eldest son, George, and her husband in a feast of gold, the gullets replaced with purses. This image celebrates the granting of funds from the Duchy of Cornwall to George IV, while the two men are described delicately with only minor distortion and wearing silly clothes. He's dressed as a fool, and the king is dressed in women's clothing. Charlotte is contorted and distended. Her face is surreal and her body completely replaced by her craw. It's unknown why Gilray disliked her so much, but this is one of the most disfigured images. In Sin, Death and the Devil, this image is based on a passage from Milton and copied from a painting by Hogarth. It's the most vicious of Gilray's images of Charlotte. She is Medusa Sin in the middle, with sagging duds and a hand on William Pitt's genitals. It's the antithesis of the serene, composed icons paintings produced of her, but it was part of her public image, displayed in print shop windows and dispersed by buyers, so if you bought it, you'd show people. Okay. So I mentioned that there's a gap in her imagery between 1781...
What's the other character that's written before those?
That's Pitt. I don't know. I would suggest a Google. I've lost track of all the politicians that she's defending Pitt from. So I said that there's a gap between 1781, Gainsborough, and then the Beachy. And this is an image that comes between. All the other images I've shown you are in the Royal Collection. They were commissioned by the family. This image too, which is by Sir Thomas Lawrence, 1789, that's in the National Gallery, was commissioned, but they never bought it. It never joined the collection. It stayed in Lawrence's studio. It was originally planned by the king to be turned into a print. It was meant to be seen, but it was not. Though I must say, it's the greatest portrait of Charlotte. It's an absolute banger. Painted in 1789, this image of the Queen was made in the year of her husband's first bout of madness. It's an image of disorder. It's not a pair, though the king retroactively sat for a matching painting in 1792. It is a picture of the Queen on her own, and it's this quality not the fact that she's got her head uncovered, which is always used as an excuse for why they didn't buy it, that caused it to be rejected. All the other large-scale images of Charlotte, this is big, that we've looked at, have been either completed pairs or images of her with her children. Here she is a queen that sits as a queen under a cloth of estate and on a dais with literally no king, apart from the bracelets that she displays. This is a break in Charlotte's iconography, and it's a disruption in her visual narrative. The 17-year-old princess ordered from abroad to produce 15 children, the last 6 years before, a wife and mother, but not a queen with a capital Q. So this is the only time she's on her own. It's a visual break in other ways. Though she is in day dress, she sits in state, though it's on a rather pedestrian chair. She is alone with us and the artist, and she is literally described by rough and swirling strokes, if you look at the detail of the hip. This is the magic of an early Lawrence, who's only 20 when he painted this. It is all contradiction and upheaval, as provided by the X-rays, that's an X-ray of it, that show the repainting and layers of work. So much did Charlotte dislike sitting for this work that she had her faithful dresser, Mrs. Pappendike, sit for the hands. The dresser later commenting that of Charlotte's portraits, this was the greatest likeness. This image fills the gap between Gainsborough and Beechey. It's the visual moment Charlotte goes from smiling with a calm dog to a hesitant, nervous in the Beechey. There's a definite change in feel. And it just records, if you look, you can actually see the close-up, it records what happened to her. It was claimed that her hair went white overnight and she aged rapidly, and it's all caught in this image. It's all over the place. Is she a queen? Is she just a normal woman in her dress? She's sitting on a normal chair, but she's on a dais. The messages are all confused. Charlotte's iconography was largely a play on queen, wife, mother, that she inherited from Caroline and Augusta before her. But living at a time where Britain had an expanding market of art producers, partly thanks to the actions of her husband in founding the Royal Academy in 1767, Charlotte was able to be represented in more interesting ways in these roles. She went beyond this tradition when portrayed by Zoffany. She was an elegant, stylish woman, as well as the hub of her own family nexus. And Kaufman, though this latter seems to have been unsuccessful or disquieting enough to be the last time she ventured into the fantastic. While she was painted by all the leading and aspirant painters of her time, she followed her own taste, preferring Gainsborough to Reynolds and Beechey to Lawrence, and patiently accepting the horrors of strolling. That was that last one, right? The small one. There is no record of why Gilray attacked her so viciously. He must have known that she wielded little power with her husband. Perhaps the peculiarity of her features, something that changed with every artist, though none of them match up, appealed to his more vicious and grotesque side. Here we go.
Any questions?
At what point historically were artists able to start publishing such satirical and censored images of royalty, without being skinned alive?
Well, they didn't get skinned alive before. It's a myth.
Henry VIII presumably would have had them.
No.
No?
No.
Stabbed or killed or something?
No. I mean, look, the Henry VIII is satirised, but he's satirised abroad.
No, by a printer in London.
Yeah,
they usually get a hold of.
So you've got Charles I is satirised, and nothing happens. It's more about the written word. They ignore pictures because the establishment thinks that if it isn't in paint, it's not important. But the Commonwealth, they use a lot of, the Cromwellians used a lot of visual satire drawings. But the king was too blind to realise that they made a difference. And they thought they had too small an audience. Of course, they were passed round. Yes. So they've always been allowed. They've always been. I mean, it's only actually like under the Victorians that you start getting censorship. People saying you shouldn't do that. But no, nothing happened. I mean, you saw how horrible the Gilrays were, and nothing happened. I don't know what would have happened had Gilray attacked the king or done something about his madness, but he didn't. Yeah. He always portrayed him in quite normally. It's Charlotte that gets the
Okay.
the kicking.
We
And
can-
again, actually earlier with Caroline and Augusta, Augusta gets a lot of negative satirical works, alluding to her having an affair and being a whore. And that nothing happens because she's a woman, quite frankly.
Yeah, then in the 20th century, right? I mean, with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was hated by people that disliked Roosevelt with a white-hot
Yeah.
hate for no obvious reason,
Yeah,
and to some extent Hillary Clinton.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, no one hated Bill Clinton as much as they hated Hillary
But
Clinton.
the thing is that attacking women for what they look like, which is what they mainly did, how they did it, it's meant, it's always been accepted.
It's all in good fun.
Yeah, it's all in good fun, they don't mean it, it's just ridiculous. It's just what's accepted. If you're going to, you attack them for their fashion, you attack them for things which are considered frivolous. And you make light of their interests, and it's easier to attack.
It's indirect.
Yeah, but if they attacked a man, he'd attack back. He'd take them to court. Women couldn't. I mean, literally, women couldn't hold a court case. They didn't belong to themselves. They belonged to their husbands or their fathers. So they couldn't do anything. And if they did, they had to do really drastic things. But women couldn't attack back.
How many, I didn't realise she had so many children. What
Yeah.
age did she have those children?
They were all produced by the age of 40. Her last one was 37. 3 of her children died before her, at least 3. So yeah.
You've got to have some sort of, she must have been a fairly, she doesn't look particularly, she looks fairly slight
Yeah.
build, but
Well-
I mean to have that
Well, she
many
was
children.
so the comments on her physical being was that when she was 17 she was very slight. I mean, so much so that they sent a set pair of her corsets over to have her dresses made for her wedding and for her state coronation, and they were too big. She was very, very slight at 17. But she produced, there was one stage where she had 4 children in 4 years. She didn't have any stillbirths, she didn't have any miscarriages. And she lost Alfred and Octavius. Alfred was a baby, a toddler, and Octavius was 4 or 5. So she managed to get them past most of the horrors. She had them inoculated. Augusta had 11, so, it was... and of course, the joke is that she had 15 children and she ended up with 1 legitimate grandchild. 1 legitimate grandchild. So, that's how the race for Victoria's birth came. She had them all by the age of 40, between 18 and 40. There was a gap of 5 years between Alfred dying and her having Amelia. I think Amelia was the last one. Which was, and then that was it. Yeah.
In terms of the, obviously there was some very political choices clearly in the construction and content of the portraits, but presumably the selection of the painters played into the politics, which she said she'd Scottish artists when they were trying to sell the idea that the Stuarts were the usurpers and the American artists during the
it's
War of Independence.
interesting that those 2 things happen, and what I found is that people don't really comment on that. They so Alan Ramsay he didn't become painted to the king through an admin cock-up, but he was suggested by Augusta's henchman, Lord Bute, who was a very well-educated Scottish nobleman, and he suggested, I know this guy, Alan Ramsay, and he'd travelled to France, so he could paint like a Frenchman, but he was British. And it was like, well, that's great, we've got a British artist. The fact he was Scottish and a member, a proper establishment, a member of the Enlightened establishment, didn't really count. He was a British artist. And he got on well. Actually, some of the choices were about how well they got on with the painters. So, for example, the choice of Gainsborough over Reynolds was because Gainsborough talked to the Queen and was very interested in music and played music and was friends with Carl Frederick Abel, who was one of the Queen's friends, and could talk music to the King as well. Whereas Reynolds was all deference and sort of saluting my liege, but they didn't get on with the King. Beachley said, you know, got to the stage where the princesses he was drawing were just walking in and out in their, almost in their underwear. And he got on very well, whereas Lawrence was 20 years old and eager, and also just too perceptive with his brush. So the choice of West is different. The king had already commissioned 10 works from West before. He was his painter of history painting. So it was before the American War of Independence. But it just so happens that the state portraits, which potentially could be an official image, happened during the War of Independence. I mean, to have an American painter celebrating the king as a figure in a uniform, with a camp of soldiers behind them, while the American War, I mean, there's a lot going, a lot to unpack, as they say, in that. But partly, a big chunk of it was because George really liked the way he painted. No one comments, in the records from the Royal Academy, no one comments on the fact that Benjamin West is painting royal portraits during a war. It's just bizarre. It's just, let's not talk about the war. Just get your paintbrush out. It's a very strange thing. But I agree with you that there is a connection, but it might just not have even been in their minds. It might just have been that being brought up as political animals, they chose them. Yeah, I don't think Charlotte liked Benjamin West particularly. There's no comment on that compared to her liking of Gainsborough. But yeah, there's definitely a thing of, we're facing an anti-Hanoverian feeling, so we'll get a Scottish painter who paints like a Frenchman. You know. Hannah?
Tell us about the jewelled stomacher.
The jewelled stomacher. So a stomacher is a piece of the fabric that goes in the front of an 18th century dress. And part of the jewellery that George commissioned a lot of jewellery for his wife. And he commissioned this stomacher, which was a fine network of diamonds with diamond flowers over the top. And it cost £60,000 when it was, in those days, it would be worth over £1 million. And it became sort of, you knew the Queen through her jewellery. Because some of the images of her don't look anything like her, but they all have the same jewellery. Because somebody bought a print by Fry where he delicately drawn these jewels, and then they just drew a face and put the jewellery on it. You get loads that you wouldn't know who they were. But if you can spot the jewellery, which is a pair of bracelets, this weird little diadem thing with a dangling jewel, and this stomacher, then you can guess that it's Queen Charlotte. Later on, when the fashion had changed from the floral and diamonds, she changed it. In the picture by Reynolds, she has the diamonds are in a different configuration, and she kept rechanging and setting the diamonds because that's what you did. You just, you had to have the latest fashion and everything. But the classic thing happened that when Queen Victoria became queen, she couldn't be Queen of Hanover because it's a Salic law, so it's just men. And she had to give the King of Hanover, who was her uncle, Duke of Cambridge, the jewels that had been given to Queen Charlotte because he claimed that they were part of the Hanoverian inheritance. So then Queen Victoria had to buy lots of new jewellery. But she still never matched the stuff that Charlotte left. I mean, she had the description of the jewellery she had was unbelievable. But you don't see it very much. I mean, she's got diamond studs. These are her famous diamond studs. So these little pop marks here are the diamond studs she was given for her hair. And here we go. She wears them in, where are you? She wears them in her cap here. You can't see it in this, but they're in here. And she wears them in her cap here. And she wears them in her cap here. And she particularly wears them, they're really well described, in her hair for Zophony. She's always got them. Same with her, she has this 5-string of pearls that are wrapped around. She always has that. You can follow the jewellery. You can trace the jewellery. But the bracelets were famous because she then started wearing, so in the horrible, it's absolutely disgusting portrait by Strolling. I mean, it's really worth looking it up on the. She's got her pearl bracelets, but she's not showing the portrait on the. So there she's got the portrait of George. At her chest, she holds it. She started particularly wearing that in portraits after he had his episode, his first episode. She has the bracelet in this one again. And in this strolling one, she has the likeness of George here. And then later on, when the prints come out, she's always got George somewhere. It's quite creepy. I do find it. I did have a file called, George Head, because I just put all the pictures which had him lurking there. But you can just put her jewellery is always really well described because it was real. When I first saw portraits of women, did they just add jewellery, make it up to make them look grand? But no, it was the real deal. So yeah, it's always this is one where she's domestic housewife. Why did they have another sitting? Oh, that's why. Because there are hundreds of them and they're all coming to get me. And this is the portrait, by the way, that broke Gaines' that was a connection with the Royal Academy. It was hung in a way he didn't like, so he didn't go back. He said it had to be in a certain place so they could see it, and they didn't do it, so he walked out. Anyway, okay. I don't think there are any more. You can all have a break now.
Well, come again. Well done.